Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to what will be our final presentation of the afternoon. A few housekeeping issues first. As with most of the presentations today, this presentation will be recorded, and Dr. Malloy has made his slides available for review, as Dave Okada described in his opening comments. My name is Jeff Dunn, and I will be your moderator for this presentation. And the topic is the proximal warning behavior typology after a decade. What have we learned? And our presenter is Dr. Reid Malloy. And for most of you on this broadcast, Dr. Malloy certainly needs no introduction to any of us working in the arena of violence risk assessment. As a moderator, I frequently attempt to pare down my introductions so as to provide more time for the presentation. But in reviewing Dr. Malloy's resume, that makes that very difficult, if not impossible. But I will certainly try, so please bear with me. Dr. Reid Malloy is a board-certified forensic psychologist and consults on criminal and civil cases throughout the United States and Europe. He is a former clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine and a faculty member of the San Diego Psychoanalytic Center. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and is past president of the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. He has received a number of awards and honors, including the first National Achievement Award in 1998, from the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, ATAP, as well as the Manfred Guttmacher Award from the American Psychiatric Association in 2021. Dr. Malloy has authored or co-authored over 250 papers published in peer-reviewed psychiatric and psychological journals, and he has authored or co-authored or edited 13 different books. He has been consulting, researching, and writing about personality disorder, psychopathy, stalking, narcissism, criminality, mental disorder, and targeted violence for the past 30 years. His first book, The Psychopathic Mind, was an integration of the biological and psychodynamic understanding of psychopathy. He co-edited a book with Drs. Hoffman and Sheridan, Stalking, Threatening, and Attacking Public Figures, which led to a commissioned study for the National Academy of Sciences on threats toward public figures that was published in 2011. The first edition of the International Handbook of Threat Assessment was published in 2014, and the second edition in 2021. Dr. Stephen White and Dr. Malloy created the Waiver 21, a structured professional judgment instrument for targeted workplace and campus violence. And Dr. Malloy has been a consultant on criminal, counterintelligence, and counterterrorism cases for behavioral analysis units with the FBI and Quantico for the past 21 years. His counterterrorism work began when he was retained as the consulting forensic psychologist by the U.S. Attorney General in the prosecution of the defendants McVeigh and Nichols in the Oklahoma City bombing cases. He is the originator and the developer of the TRAP-18 Terrorist Radicalization Assessment Protocol, which is a validated risk assessment instrument used by counterterrorism professionals in North America and Europe. And I could certainly go on and on, but suffice to say, that our discipline of violence risk assessment and strategizing on case management would not be where we are today without the foundational work of Dr. Malloy. So it's an honor for me to moderate this presentation and to introduce Dr. Reid Malloy. Reid?
Thanks, Jeff, very much. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
Okay, good. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. I'll allow Zoom to, let's see. Oh, come on. Can't waste time with this stuff. Okay, I got a problem with the screen share, Jeff.
Can we get somebody from headquarters to assist Dr. Malloy getting his slide presentation?
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not coming up right away.
Be happy to do that, Dr. Malloy. What is it that you're seeing on your screen right now?
Well, I have it says, I'm at the security and privacy thing. You have my slide deck, correct?
I do believe so, yes.
Okay, let's, just because in the interest of time, if you could just bring that up and then I could just tell you to move from slide to slide. Is this Amanda?
This is.
Yeah, Amanda, that would be great. I just don't want to waste any time here with the technical problem. If you can bring it up. I think you have it in a PDF.
I believe I do have it in a PDF. Give me just a second to pull
thanks.
that up here.
You can do this much faster than I can, right? Sorry about this. Sorry about this, folks, but we've all been here. What I'm going to do here, as Amanda's doing, bringing up the slide deck, what I'm going to do is in a pretty rapid way, I'm going to go through all the brief overview of the warning behaviors for those of you that aren't familiar with it. There we are. And then we're going to look at the research. I tend to talk pretty rapidly, and there's a lot of data in here. So my suggestion is that you not take notes, that you just sit back and absorb what you can, and given your level of interest, and then also you'll be able to see the slide deck. So you could go to the next one there, Amanda. This is just a first disclosure that I do earn income from the TRAP 18, of which the warning behaviors are part. They're the first part of the TRAP 18. Okay, next. And what we're trying to do here with threat assessment, of course, is to try to detect the signals amidst all the noise. And we're living in a time where there's lots of noise. And my work has been devoted basically to targeted violence and targeted attacks. And then how do we attack the pre-offense warning behaviors that precede such acts? Of course, tasks that we're all very interested in doing. Okay, next. And here's the question. Are there patterns of behavior that correlate with and in some cases predict acts of targeted violence? Next. And here are the 8 proximal warning behaviors. These were first developed by my colleagues Jens Hoffman, Angela Guldemann, and David James. Jens is from Germany, Angela is from Switzerland, David is from the UK. And we got together in 2010, 2011, did an extensive review of all the data up to that point in time, and then formed this typology. And then this became our model. And then what we've been doing, of course, is we've been spending a large amount of time over the past decade just testing this model empirically to see if it works. Okay, next. What are these? These are patterns of behavior rather than individual risk factors. What we like to do in this work is to take the approach of what's called pattern analysis. This originally came out of the Germans and the Gestalt psychologists, and I've listed several of them there. And these are proximally related to violence. At least that was the formulation. And to give you a sense of pattern analysis, if you could go to the next slide, and I'm just going to pause here for a moment and let all of you read this to yourselves. And of course, you can see what it says. How can I read these words without any vowels? And the reason you can do this is because your brain is conducting pattern analysis below the level of consciousness all the time. And what I've done with this slide is I brought it into consciousness for a moment where you can easily read this without actually seeing any vowels in the sentence. And pattern analysis is how our brains both visually process information as well as how our brains will auditorily process information. Okay, next. And the first of these proximal warning behaviors, this is pathway. Everybody knows what this is. What we've done with as a proximal warning behavior is we're looking at the later stage markers on the pathway, and you can see them here. Any behavior that is part of research, planning, preparation, or implementation of an attack. So we have not included personal grievance as a pre-offense proximal warning behavior, with the emphasis upon proximal. That one of the things we've been very interested in doing is looking at the behaviors that are in very close time proximity to a targeted attack, to have as much sensitivity, but also specificity as we possibly could in the research. Okay, and if you could go to the next slide. Amanda, thanks. And here you can see it just visually represented. We've taken Fine and Voskuil's original work, and then Calhoun and Weston's steps on the pathway to violence. And then the red rectangular box is capturing the pathway warning behavior as a proximal warning behavior. Okay, next. And then I think I have a case here. This is out of Halle, Germany in 2019. Next slide. And this is Stefan Balliet. And you can see this was actually from his manifesto. And let me just read you a sentence or two from this. First is a local synagogue. Damn, that's not a soft target. For some reason, the security measures are quite high. The building is surrounded by apartment blocks on 2 sides and borders a Jewish graveyard. The graveyard is surrounded by a 3 meter high wall, only one entrance next to the one of the synagogue. And speaking of that, of which there's a surveillance cam right above the gate. So you can see how very tactical, very focused this is in terms of very specific preparation to implement his attack. And that's what we mean when we're using pathway as a proximal warning behavior, specific tactical details that have been uncovered in the case that the person is incorporated into his thinking and into his planning and preparation. Okay, next. Here's again from Balliet's manifesto. He used a lot of homemade weapons, and here are 3 of them that he attached to the end of his manifesto. Next. Secondly is fixation warning behavior. This is how we defined it: any behavior that indicates an increasingly pathological preoccupation with a person or a cause, typically causing deterioration of social and occupational functioning. So that's our definition. The deterioration is very important. Next. And what we've also been doing research on recently, this is in particular with Dr. Tahir Rahman, a friend and colleague at Washington University in St. Louis, and we're looking at the cognitive affective drivers. In other words, in a sense, what's behind a fixation. And we've identified 3 pathological drivers, and you see them here on the slide: extreme overvalued belief, delusion, and obsession. Next slide. And then we've also, here we illustrated a little more and defined it a little more carefully. For the clinicians here, you know what an obsession is and what a delusion is. And where we've had to do a lot of new work is looking at extreme overvalued beliefs, which are typically very egocentric. They're shared by others, they're frequent, and they're intense. Okay, next. And here's the full definition of extreme overvalued beliefs. We feel this is very useful, particularly in the times we're living in, where we're focused on the thinking of extremists on their way to radicalized violence. And here, what I've done is highlighted in yellow some of the most important things of an extreme overvalued belief. It's shared by others. The thinking becomes simplistic, binary, and absolute. And typically this builds a very intense emotional commitment to the belief that may, of course, then lead to violent behavior in the service of the belief. Okay, next. Now, here's an example from the McVeigh case of 2 of his EOBs, his extreme overvalued beliefs. ATF FBI murdered the Branch Davidian men, women, and children at Waco, Texas on April 19th, 1993. And then secondly, one of his EOBs was, I will be the first hero of the Second American Revolution. And for those folks that are not that familiar with this case, this was the largest, still is the largest domestic act of terrorism that we've had in the United States. Now, both of these EOBs are simple, binary, meaning they're very black and white. They're absolute. You know, there's no conditionality associated with them, yet they are also both false. But McVeigh believed these, and these were part of his drivers on his road to terrorism. Okay, next. And here's what he did. Oklahoma City, 168 people were killed April 19th, 1995. Next. Now we've done, this is new data to show you, we've taken a really close look at how often does fixation warning behavior occur in cases. And these are a series of studies. We've been involved, my research group has been involved in many of these studies, but also there have been independent studies done. You can see the frequency on the right. It's a fairly large aggregated sample now of 377 cases. Okay, next slide. And what you see here on average, this is the takeaway, that about 81% of targeted attackers will evidence fixation, a pathological fixation, before they mount their attack. In fact, this is one of the first proximal warning behaviors, if not the first proximal warning behavior we see surface in a case that eventuates in a targeted attack. Okay, next. And one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill: a fanatic is one who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. Next. Another illustration, this is Malik Hassan, Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood, Texas massacre, November 5th, 2009. And in the next slide, you will see her during his residency and fellowship. He was required to give several presentations focusing on psychiatry, but what he did instead was focused upon Muslims in the military, no psychiatric aspect to his talk. And this is how we illustrate oftentimes a fixation, that there's a disjuncture. In other words, the person loses sight of the fact that their preoccupation overrides any good judgment about what is socially acceptable or what is socially expected. And so you see this disjuncture in fixations, where the person will be so, in a sense, preoccupied with his belief and have such intense emotion surrounding it that he just can't hold back, and he expresses this in situations that are just not socially appropriate. Okay, next. And here's some example. This was after the mass murder, and you can see as you read some of this how they did focus on his fixation, particularly the first one. I was focused, I had a mission to accomplish. These are statements he made to the evaluating psychiatrist whom I talked to gather this information. If you look at the fourth bullet point here, I don't think what I did was wrong because it was for the greater cause of helping my Muslim brothers. But personally, he regretted being paralyzed. And the simple binary and absolute statement was that he was killing because the soldiers, the US soldiers, were going against the Islamic Empire. Okay, next. Here he is in custody. Next. Now, the next proximal warning behavior identification. Here's the full definition of it. And you can see there are different parts to it. But what we're thinking about here specifically is a shift in self-identity. Any behavior that indicates a psychological desire to be a pseudo-commando, have a warrior mentality, closely associate with weapons, identify with previous attackers, or to identify oneself as an agent to advance a particular cause or belief system. Okay, next. And here's Malik Hassan's business card. What you'll notice here, if you look very carefully, he did spell health wrong, but that's not what is important about this card. He was passing this out at Fort Hood in Texas in the summer before the attack. And what you see underneath his name is his allegiances not to the U.S. Army. There's no acknowledgement on this card that he was a major in the U.S. Army. But what we do have instead is SOA, and SOA stands for Soldier of Allah. So he was actually passing this out, and this became his new radicalized identity, that he was now a soldier of Allah. Okay, next. Breivik the same way. A lot of times self-identity identification is captured in uniforms, amulets, insignias, perhaps tattoos, certain things that people will put on their body. And here's Breivik, who identified as a member of the Knights Templar, the 12th century, what I call the special forces of the Christian Crusades. And he needed a uniform, however, in a sense, to cement this identity for him. He constructed this whole uniform. He had no association with the military or law enforcement whatsoever. He bought all these pieces to the uniform, assembled it himself, and then took a photograph of himself and attached this to his manifesto. Okay, next. But here's the takeaway for this evolution from fixation to identification. What we found in our research is that identification will oftentimes correlate and significantly separate the attacker from the non-attacker. And here's the simple definition. We're moving from what one thinks about all the time to what one becomes. And this is a critical operational shift to watch for in your cases, because this may indicate mobilization for violence. And on the next slide, you're going to see an example of this from Nicholas Cruz. This is actually fairly from a time perspective. This was 6 months before the attack on Valentine's Day in February of 2018, when he attacked Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. But this actually, he posted on a bail bondsman's website of, I'm going to be a professional school shooter. So this, in a sense, becomes just a classic example of this movement from preoccupation to a new self-identity or an identification as a proximal warning behavior. Okay, next. Novel aggression. What we're looking at here is capability or ability, and the person needing to test their ability to engage in a targeted attack. Next. And here's an example of this. This actually is a case out of Europe where we had 2 suicide bombers that killed themselves in March 2016. And then one of the surviving attackers reported to investigators months later what you're going to see on the next slide. And if you go to that. So here is the attacker that survived talking about the 2 attackers that were killed. Khalid told me he and Ibrahim shot someone dead on the street. Khalid explained it was an elderly person and they wanted to test what it was like to kill someone. So this is a very good example of novel aggression, and the Belgian police were able to confirm through an unsolved homicide that the victim of this had been a man named Paul Andre van der Peren, who had been murdered several years earlier. Okay, next. Here are the brothers that had committed this homicide. Energy burst is acceleration of activity in the hours, days, or weeks before the attack. And we're looking at any accelerated behavior. The importance here is that you also are judging, you've calibrated what the typical level of activity is for the person, and then you're looking for accelerated behavior. And oftentimes we will see a change in social media activity. It may increase, but usually it decreases. So we have greater on the ground behavior and diminished online behavior. So you see this, in a sense, this inverse negative correlation between the two. Okay, next. And my illustration here is the Jared Loughner case out of Tucson. Next slide. And just again, you can see as you read these, he dropped off a film, checks into a motel, does web searches, picks up the photos at 02 in the morning, makes a purchase, go to the next slide, and through the night leaves a telephone message with a friend. He's obviously staying up. He sends out on his MySpace page, goodbye friends, goes to Walmart Circle K store looking for more ammunition at 0600. Go to the next slide. Unable to purchase the ammunition at Walmart, but able to purchase it at Circle K, stopped by a police officer, not ticketed, just given a warning, confronted by his dad, and then eventually returns to the supermarket where Gabby Giffords is giving a talk, and there is where he carried out the mass murder. Next slide. Okay, next slide. And here we have, as we come down the home stretch on the proximal warning behaviors, this is leakage. And leakage is very different from a direct threat. Leakage is communication to a third party of intent to do harm to a target. Like many of these indicators, there are papers on my website about them. The one we did on leakage, I did with Mary Ellen O'Toole. This, again, is very distinctive from a direct threat because of the high frequency of it among attackers. And if you could go to the next slide. In leakage, we see, if you look at all the studies that have been done so far, it precedes a majority of acts of targeted violence 60 to 90% of the time. This is a very important takeaway, that you're going to see leakage in the majority of targeted attackers. And this, again, should alert you, of course, for the need for investigation. But there is a paradox in this data point. And if you could go to the next slide, that we also know that most individuals who will leak intent never act on their threats. So even though the majority of attackers engage in leakage, most of the leakage that we investigate turns out to be a false positive. In other words, there is actually no serious intent to carry out an attack. But how that leaves us as investigators and as assessors is we have to investigate all cases of leakage. And the risk with these investigations is we become tired and we become complacent because we run into so many false positive cases. Okay, next. And then on the home stretch here, last resort evidence of a violent action imperative and time imperative. This is from an excellent paper that my friend Chris Mohandi did that was in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin with Officer Duffy. This phrasing of violent action imperative, time imperative. And then you can see further elaboration here. The subject believes he has no other choice and must act now. And I've got several examples of this. If you go to the next slide, these examples illustrate that leakage last resort behavior sometimes is something one is anticipating is going to happen in the future, and therefore he arrives at a position of last resort, or it's a loss that has just happened, triggering last resort. And it also could be external, could be an actual event, or it could be internal pressure that the person has within him or herself to act. Okay, next slide. Here's an example from the Charleston, South Carolina attack on the Emmanuel African Methodist Church. And here you see Dylan's roof, last resort statement. I have no choice. I'm not in the position to alone go into the ghetto and fight. I chose Charleston because it is the most historic city in my state, and at one time had the highest ratio of blacks to whites. We have no skinheads, no real KKK, no one doing anything but talking. Well, someone has to have the bravery to take it to the real world, and I guess that has to be me. So you can see the internal pressure here that he generated in himself. Nobody's telling him to do this. He's self-radicalized and then move forward. This is just an excellent example of last resort behavior. Next slide. Here's another more current example. This was a Tree of Life synagogue attack in 2018. Robert Bowers, Highest likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in. And this was tweeted out by him in the moments before the attack. I have several other even more recent examples here. On the next slide, here's the attack on the FBI field office in Cincinnati this past August, and I'm just going to read you some passages here. This again was on Twitty, Ricky Schiffer. This was what he tweeted out. This is Ricky Schiffer's account. People, this is it. I hope a call to arms comes from someone better qualified, but if not, this is your call to arms from me. Leave work tomorrow as soon as the gun shop opens. Get whatever you need to be ready for combat. We must not tolerate this one. They have been conditioning us to accept tyranny and think we can't do anything for 2 years. Now, this context, of course, was several days after the service of the warrant on Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence, and Schiffer, in a sense, is expressing last resort warning behavior here. Another Twitter follower asked the question in the middle of this slide, are you proposing terrorism? And Schiffer writes, very important question, no, I'm proposing war. Be ready to kill the enemy, not mass shootings where leftists go, not lighting buses on fire with transsexuals in them. Violence is not all terrorism. Kill the FBI on sight and be ready to take down other active enemies of the people and those who try to prevent you from doing it. Okay, next slide. That's an example, again, of last resort. We've just done a recent analysis, this hasn't been published yet, of how often do last resort proximal warning behaviors occur in targeted attacks. And our data, again, a large aggregated sample, 377 subjects from 11 different data sets, about 2/3 of the time you will see last resort behavior preceding a targeted attack. Okay, next. Here's, again, just I think a good takeaway slide on this. Simply put, last resort is I must be violent and I must be violent now. It's a call to action. But also very important here is there's a time compression evident that it's not next week, it's not next month. It must happen now because we are facing an imminent existential threat. So in the mind of the attacker, this can be rationalized as defensive violence, because he is taking hostile action against an individual or a group that is posing an imminent existential threat, an immediate life-threatening condition is being faced, and he must act. Okay, next. And then the last one, directly communicated threat warning behavior, is simply what it says, communication of a direct threat to the target or law enforcement beforehand. And the next slide. Typically, this is the least frequent warning behavior. It is in the typology because it is important, but typically less than 20% of targeted attackers will evidence direct threat proximal warning behavior. Okay, next. An example, very unusual, Nashville, Tennessee, December 25th, 2020. You'll all remember this. A van pulls into downtown Nashville, loudspeaker comes on. the voice of a woman saying, all buildings in this area must be evacuated now. If you can hear this message, evacuate now. Audio recording. And then there was Petula Clark singing an old pop melody called Downtown in between. And the next slide, here you see the perpetrator in the lower right in downtown Nashville. What's interesting about this is it was a suicide bombing. And typically suicide bombings, there is both a homicidal and a suicidal element to it. In other words, the person wants to die, but then they also want to kill other people. In this case, we have a very publicly facing act of suicide, that is a bombing, but with specific warnings against people that were in the area to clear out. So I think this communicates the fact that he did not have homicidal intent. He was intent on destruction of property and then also on ending his own life. Okay, next. Now, that's a 50-mile-an-hour look at the proximal warning behaviors. But then what we'd like to think about, and what we've been working on for a long time now, is there sensitivity? In other words, can the proximal warning behaviors detect a targeted attacker? And then do they have those specificity? In other words, how good is the absence of proximal warning behaviors telling us that there's not going to be an attack? So we're looking for both how they work in identifying attackers, as well as how they work in identifying non-attackers by their absence. Okay, next. And here I'm going to take you through, again, just a whirlwind look at the research and what we found in the past decade. This was one of our, actually, this was our very first study. We looked at lethal non-terrorist attackers of public figures in Germany. Next slide, please. And here's the configuration. You can see the 8 proximal warning behaviors. Notice how pathway fixations stand out very clearly from the get-go. And this is basically just looking at sensitivity, like to what degree do proximal warning behaviors show up in a first study. In other words, is there real-world ecological validity for the proximal warning behaviors, or is this just a figment of our imagination and has no basis in reality? Well, this was, again, a positive finding that it did tend to fit this kind of unusual, very small sample. Okay, next. And then what we did is I applied it to a subsample of the Secret Service study that Robert and Brian did. It was first published in 1999 in Journal of Forensic Sciences. This is a subsample of 18 presidential and public figure attackers in the United States. Next slide. And here's how they look. And so you begin to see similar patterns. Notice how low direct threat is, but notice pathway fixation identification do stand out. Okay, next slide. And then we were able to take a look at, do our first comparative study. This was done in Germany, and this was looking at school attackers, but then also individuals who were of concern but did not mount any attack. They were of concern to people, but they did not mount any attack and appeared upon investigation to have no intent to do so. So the first slide I'm going to show you here are the attackers. And if you could go to the next slide and notice with the school shooters, it's a very small sample. This again is the first decade of this century. There were 9 school attackers, and you can see how they did load on most of the proximal warning behaviors, with the exception of direct threat being very low. And then the next slide, you're going to see the comparative group. And notice here, now we're getting into some specificity. Notice leakage is very high when you compare this to the shooters. It's about identical. But notice direct threat is higher in the kids with no intent. And then also notice that the other proximal warning behaviors almost disappear completely. And so this was very significant in giving us some direction as far as threat assessment and threat management, that when we get leakage, we want to then turn to the other proximal warning behaviors and see if they are apparent or not in the case. Okay, next slide. Here's another way of looking at that data for those of you interested. Significantly greater frequency of those among the attackers of the proximal warning behaviors on the left. And then you can see the effect sizes. This is an important statistical finding on the right side. We had large effect sizes for the difference between the attackers and the non-attackers. Okay, next. We then move forward. This is a study that Paul Gill and I did that came out now about 6 years ago. We looked at a large sample of terrorists, 111. These were individuals in both US and Europe. Go to the next slide. And what I'm showing you here, this is a methodology slide for those of you that are interested. Then go to the next slide. I wanted to show you what we did, just one section of this study, and that is we were able to compare ideologies. In other words, attackers who were motivated by jihadism, extreme right-wing targeted attackers, and also single-issue attackers. Many of these individuals were anti-abortionists who decided to carry out an attack. And if you go to the next slide, these next 3 slides, you're going to see. What I want you to do is just hold this visually in mind. These are the Islamic extremists, and you can see how they look, and you can see the patterns that should be actually quite familiar to you now as you've looked at some different data. But notice the Islamic extremists pathway behaviors or proximal warning behaviors. Okay, go to the next slide. Here's the extreme right wing. You can see the proximal warning behaviors, and then go to the next slide. And here are the single issue folks. Notice that all 3 slides are virtually identical. And that takes us to the next slide in the deck, which is that it appears that the proximal warning behaviors to be useful correlates regardless of ideology. So you can use the proximal warning behaviors across different belief systems if you have an ideology that appears to be driving your case that you're working on. Okay, next. Another study we did, this was a comparative study of North American terrorists and subjects of concern. I know Gwen is on the website. Gwen was very instrumental, and her colleagues up in Calgary in helping us gather these subjects. We were able to compare both individuals of concern for carrying out a targeted violent attack, as well as individuals that did. And so we had 33 among the attackers and 23 among the non-attackers. And let me show you, this was LA and Calgary. What we found was that the proximal warning behaviors did discriminate between the attackers and the non-attackers. Here are the proximal warning behaviors that had medium to large effect sizes for separating out the attackers from the non-attackers. And notice directly communicated threat was again negatively correlated. So you get more direct threats among a group of non-attackers than you will from a group of attackers. Okay, next. We then did another study using a different method of analysis. This is called multidimensional scaling. And the question here is, do indicators cluster in predicted ways? So this is mapping in 2-dimensional space how the proximal warning behaviors look from the same data set that I just talked about. And if you go to the next slide, here you see all the subjects. So there were 56 subjects together, attackers and non-attackers. And you can, the green are the distal characteristics that we're going to ignore in this talk. We're looking specifically at the blue, which are the proximal warning behaviors. And you can see them here. And this is statistically plotting them in both horizontal and vertical space. And then if you go to the next slide, this is the important takeaway. The gray are the non-attackers and the orange are the attackers. And notice how almost all the proximal warning behaviors are on the left side of the diagonal line where the attackers are. And there's very few proximal warning behaviors that show up among the non-attackers on the right. And so what you see with attackers, and this is another way of statistically demonstrating that, what you see among attackers is that the proximal warning behaviors tend to cluster together when there is an attack. And you don't see that with the non-attackers. So this is another way of studying how these data points interact with each other. Okay, next. We did a further study. This is called time sequence analysis. And the idea here, this is a new method of statistical analysis where you're not looking at just data points independent of each other. You're looking at narratives. In other words, what comes first, what comes second, what comes third, and it's the way we think as threat assessors. We're always thinking in terms of narratives and movement in time of the individual and what behaviors are showing up, what behaviors perhaps are disappearing, what new behaviors are showing up pre-offense. And that's the way we think. This is a statistical way of looking at data sets to look for time sequence and time movement. So if you could go to the next slide, this is a monster slide. There'll be a test on this at the end of the talk. Just kidding, of course. But what you have here is on the left side, you have on the left side of the slide, you have then time moving forward to the right side of the slide. If you look at the right slide, you'll see the attack. And then if you go from attack back in time, what you're seeing is when these different behaviors show up as you move closer and closer to an attack. This study, again, was published last year in JTAM, our journal. But the takeaway for today is notice that the proximal warning behaviors are in sort of a kind of an orange color. And notice that they tend to all show up as you get closer to an attack. And notice that the first proximal warning behavior that you're seeing right in the center of the slide is fixation. So fixation typically shows up first in a case, and then as the person moves closer to a targeted attack, you start to get identification, self-identity changing, and then you get, in a sense, the red flag indicators: last resort, pathway behavior, leakage, in a few cases, a direct threat. And that's where, of course, the action is going to be, and that's the urgency on a case, looking at this in terms of movement of time from left to right toward the attack. This is the first of very few studies that have been done looking at time sequencing of targeted attacking, but I hope we'll see more as our field moves forward with the science. Okay, next. Then I've got just a couple of more here. This is just a summary of what you looked at. There appear to be very important gatekeepers in these time sequencing, and there also appears to be a very important turning point event, and that's where you begin to see changes in thinking and emotion for the attacker. Okay, next. Here's a study that my friends Chalicome and Lucas did. We did not have any involvement in this case, which is in this study, which is important. They studied U.S. sovereign citizens, comparing both violent and non-violent sovereign citizens. And if you could go to the next slide, here we again were able to differentiate the attackers from the non-attackers among the sovereign citizens, we being Chalicome and Lucas, not me personally at all. But we had 4 warning behaviors that did show significant differences and positively correlated with violence, with, again, a medium to large effect size, which statistically is a very important finding. Okay, next. They did what's called a logistic regression. This is essentially a way to statistically see how you can correctly classify or not violent versus nonviolent sovereign citizens. And they were able to correctly classify 75.9, 76% of the cases. Okay, next. And then my friends in Germany, this is Nils Bachler, who's in with the federal police in Germany, forensic psychologist there. They did a nice study comparing violent and nonviolent jihadists. So these are individuals, we had 60 that were engaged in nonviolent terrorist activities compared to 20 that were convicted of violence. And Nils and his group were seeing if the TRAP-18 could discriminate and predict violence. In this particular study, the way I'm presenting it to you, I'm just looking at the proximal warning behaviors, which are the first 8 indicators on the TRAP-18. And if you could go to the next slide, they did get good discrimination, both the total number of TRAP indicators, but most importantly for this presentation, pathway, last resort, energy burst, and novel aggression separated the violent jihadists from the non-violent jihadists. Okay, next. And then a final thing that they did was to look at the predictive power. Some of you will be interested in this data. This is very good from a science perspective. We got high sensitivity, high specificity. In other words, Bachler and his group were able to show that the indicators were very sensitive in identifying attackers and also very specific in identifying people who would not attack. And this is very, very important in our work because the risk that we always run in our cases is over predicting that an attack is going to occur. And when we know that from people that have done research on over prediction. Okay, next. And then what are currently the most validated proximal warning behaviors after this decade is that these are the ones, given the research as it stands now, to key in on as a threat assessor. Are you seeing any later stage markers of pathway behavior? We're focusing there specifically on research planning, preparation, implementation. We're looking at any specific strategic and tactical behaviors. Most of them are going to also show movement from online behaviors to more on the ground behaviors. Secondly, are you seeing any identification? Do you see shifts in identity from what I'm thinking about all the time to who I become or who I want to become? That's identification. That's a self-identity proximal warning behavior. And then last resort, as the third takeaway, I must act violently and I must act now. So we have both a violent action imperative as well as a time compression imperative that I must act now. Okay, next slide. Here they are again. Here are the 8 proximal warning behaviors. Next slide. And shameless advancement of our book. And I hope that you'll all take a look at this for you that work in the field. And then I think on the next slide, and please reach out to me. I know a lot of data that I've put out there. You can get access to the slides. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and send me an email. So with that in mind, I'll kick it back to Jeff. And I think we have probably about 45 seconds left.
Well, I mean, your timing is impeccable. We do have a couple of questions, Dr. Malloy.
Yeah.
And the first one I'd like to fire away from Dr. Bressler. He said he's been using the TRAP-18 to better understand the process of radicalization in cases in which he has been hired to assess. What might one learn from the TRAP-18 that could be useful to the courts considering sentencing options, including recidivism, for convicted terrorists who were caught prior to carrying out their terroristic intentions?
Yeah, my answer to that, Jeff, is we actually need more research on that. We need more research and more studies of individuals that are perhaps, for instance, convicted of conspiracy or something along those lines prior to an attack, and see what it tells us about their behaviors and what is likely to ensue after they've been released from custody or when they're coming out on probation and parole. There are folks out there that are using it in the context of probation and parole decisions. That is something that's happening. It's happening in North America. It's also happening in Australia. And that's very important. We also have a study we did that's in JTAM. That was a case study on an individual in the Coast Guard that was convicted pre-attack, where we did an analysis using the TRAP-18. And there's a lot of information in that study. That is the initial title of that study is Troubled Waters, and it's looking at that Coast Guard case. There's a lot of information in that study that will also help answer that question.
Well, along those lines, we have another question from someone who chose to remain anonymous, but what actions can be taken to intervene just prior to the last resort behavior?
Sometimes when you get to that point, oftentimes the intervention is tactical. In other words, sometimes there needs to be an arrest of the individual. There needs to be an aggressive prosecution of them. They need to be taken off the street. If there's a psychiatric disorder, there may be a need for hospitalization. Typically, that's the point at which the threat assessment specifically may need to fully engage the law enforcement folks that are part of the interdisciplinary team as to what actions need to be taken next, because the red light flashing is that you are likely very close to a targeted attack. So the interventions typically have to be very aggressive at that point in time.
Okay, lastly, before we wrap it up, we have a question that can the TRAP 18 be used with adolescents or applied to adolescents?
We have a couple people studying that. Also, there's a study that's ongoing, that's just beginning in Australia. We don't know yet. We don't know yet. I don't have the research to say it's been validated with adolescents. But of course, I invite people that would like to, that have access to perhaps some samples of kids that could kind of test out to see how useful it is in that population to do so.
Well, thank you, Reed. This was outstanding, valuable information. I'm sure our attendees have a number of takeaways from this presentation. So thank you very much. Just outstanding as always.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, I'll see everybody soon. Hope to see you in person. Okay, bye-bye.
Just a reminder before everybody logs off that I know we have an international audience in a number of different time zones. We will be starting at the same time tomorrow that we started today. So wherever your respective time zone is, if you logged on today, same time tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and we'll talk soon.